Well, welcome to our online audience, our first Wednesday event here at Faith Community Bible Church. I just want to take a minute to introduce myself, explain the format, and the focus of tonight's event. So my name's Kirk. I'm one of the pastors here at FCBC. And the focus of our event tonight and all of our first Wednesday events is simply to bring Christians and those who aren't Christians together to talk about a topic and engage with a topic that our culture is currently having questions about. And so tonight we have an opportunity to do this all on our live stream. Normally we bring together people into our building and have questions to a live audience, but tonight will be just on live stream. We're going to have an opportunity tonight to listen to a pre-recorded video by Tim Keller, who's a best-selling New York Times author. He's written books like Prodigal God and The Reason for God, and he's a pastor of a church called Redeemer in New York City. Redeemer, New York City is right in the middle of our current coronavirus crisis, New York being one of the most affected areas. And so he has both the skills and the experience to speak directly into this topic of peace in the time of suffering. And so he'll be sharing with us tonight. The format for tonight is simply the pre-recorded talk will play in just a moment after I get done with this introduction. And while that talk is going, you have a chance to interact. And let me explain the ways that you can interact with this talk tonight. Okay, so first of all, you can go to Slido, which is sl.do in your browser on any device, whether that's a phone, an iPad, or your laptop or PC. Go to Slido, sli.do. And in there on that page, you can enter in the meeting ID number 42262. Again, that's 42262. And when you enter that meeting ID number in, you'll be able to actually enter your own questions as you're listening to the talk, and then also vote on the questions that you want to see answered. Because at the end of the talk, myself and two other pastors here at FCBC will come back on and we'll have a panel discussion about the questions that you've asked. And so please submit questions. As many as you want, vote on the questions, be involved. This is meant to be interactive. And then finally, if you don't have that ability, you can simply send a text. There's a number up in the slide that we're sharing. That's 208-809-6564. And you can just send a text in and we'll put that into the questions that we answer at the end. And so really hope that this talk, Peace in Times of Suffering, will help to give you tools that you need to understand how you can react in the midst of our current crisis, but beyond that, in anything that you're going through. And so hope you're connecting, hope you're listening, and we're going to join the talk by Tim Keller now.
Welcome to my home. And you are in my living room, which is where so many of us in our world today are doing so much of their work. And I'm glad to have you here. Justin already, let me give you a little more background. Justin already explained that this is Questioning Christianity. Questioning Christianity is a place where we explore the plausibility of belief in God in general and belief in Christianity in particular. And we do that in full light of the most serious objections and doubts that people have about Christianity. So it's a place where we talk about whether Christianity is plausible, credible, or not, and we try to give every bit of emphasis on the strongest possible objections. And what we were going to do, the topic tonight was going to be, how can you be a Christian and believe in light of all the wrongdoings of the church throughout history? That's a very, very important topic, and we have to get to it, and we will. We'll get to it in the future. This is a series of 5 monthly sessions, but it just wasn't appropriate in considering how the world has changed in the last week to talk about that. Instead, we are talking tonight about how do you find peace in the midst of, in the face of suffering and anxiety. And we're not going to look at it philosophically so much. 2 months ago, when we talked about whether we believe in God, we talked about the problem of believing in God in light of evil and suffering. I mean, how can a good God allow evil and suffering? That's a very important philosophical issue. And that's the background of what we're going to talk about tonight, but here's in the foreground. We need not to look at evil and suffering philosophically. We need to look at it practically. How do you actually face it? What do you actually do in order to move forward? That's the question. And what we're going to do in light of questioning Christianity is we're going to look at what the various religions and worldviews and cultures over the years, centuries, how they have equipped their members to face pain, suffering, loss, and anxiety. And then we're going to take a look at what Christianity has to offer. So we're going to compare the worldviews. And that way we're going to get down to practicalities. And I think that's something we all need. So let me start. Let's just ask the question, why is this important? Then what do the various religions and cultures of the world give you in order to help you face and give you peace, in the face of suffering and loss? And then finally, what does Christianity have to offer? So first, very briefly, the reason why this is important anytime, now of course we're doing it now because the world has changed, but it's always important to have a working way to handle evil and suffering because it's inevitable. You know that very famous line in Macbeth, Shakespeare's Macbeth, where it is said, "Each new morn, new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven upon the face." Quite eloquent, quite striking, and right. Each new morning, new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven on the face. Sorrow is inevitable, but for a moment, just for a second, let me talk about where we are today. In the past, most human beings understood that suffering was inevitable, that life was nasty, brutish, and short. And human beings knew that famine, pestilence, war could anytime just sweep through their country and upend everything. And so everyone knew life was fragile. Everyone knew suffering was inevitable. I would say that today we have lost some of that sense, especially since World War II. There's a sense that says, hey, our societies are high tech and we're globally connected, so that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore. But now here's what we've learned. If you're high tech and connected, new sorrows can strike you on the face. New problems come up because of high tech, because we're so connected. The reality is life is fragile. Suffering is inevitable. And therefore, there is absolutely no way that you're going to be able to make it in life unless you've got a working theory for how to face this stuff. How to face pain and suffering, how to face it well, how to face it in a way that you grow through it, how to face it. Ernest Becker, who wrote a great Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, he's got a place where he says this. He says, quote, "I think that taking life seriously means something like this, that whatever we do on this planet has to be done in the lived truth of the terror of creation, of the rumble of panic underneath everything. Otherwise, it is false." In other words, to be honest and serious about life is to realize there's a rumble of panic under everything. And the idea that if we've got it sorted, if we go to the right schools, if we're savvy, if we've got enough money in the bank, if we're careful, our life is going to be a designer life. That's just not true. Each new morn, new widows howl. Now, let's take a look at four kinds of, you can say, religions, cultures, worldviews, four historic ways that human beings have been taught to handle suffering. First of all, let's talk about karmic religions. Now, karmic religions, yes, religions that believe in karma, karmic religions are religions that believe in reincarnation. They believe that when you die, your soul migrates to another body and to another life. And you are being judged by how well you live, which means that if you've lived poorly, if you've been cruel, if you've been immoral, if you've been a bad person, then in the next life you may suffer. If you've been a good person, the next life you may do well. And eventually, you try to, by living rightly, you get off of the cycle of birth and death. And eventually you go into the all soul of the world and you go into the bliss of nirvana. Now, here's what the karmic religions think about suffering. If you're suffering, it's because you are suffering now for something you did in a past life, which means there is no unjust suffering. It's a very interesting philosophy of life. If you are living a life of privilege, it may be because of something good you've done in the past life. If you're living a terrible life, it's because of something bad you've done, which means there's no such thing as unjust suffering. And I guess you could say the karmic religions would say that the strategy toward suffering is one of resignation. Whatever you're experiencing right now is perfectly just and fair. And the best thing for you to do is, if you're suffering right now, then just do as well as you can, live as well as you can, and then maybe you'll have a better life in the next cycle of reincarnation. So I guess you could say, as I said, there's no philosophy of life more than the karmic religions that says accept life exactly as it is. It is perfectly fair. And so I guess we could say the strategy is one of resignation. Now, a second worldview or religion is Buddhism. And I may give you a little bit more detail because Buddhism has always been fascinating to me, in that Buddhism was actually born as a response to suffering. In fact, it's a religion that is there in order to deal with the problem of suffering. It's not a sideline. It's not a tangent for Buddhism. According to a Buddhist tradition, the Buddha was originally, his name was Gautama Siddhartha, and Siddhartha was a prince, and he grew up in a very posh palace. And at one point, he left his father's palace and went out into the world, and he saw suffering. And he had what's been called the four distressing sights. The four distressing sights. He saw a sick man. He saw an old man. He saw a dead man, and he saw a poor man. And he recognized suffering. And at one point, Siddhartha sat down under the Bodhi tree and contemplated trying to understand the riddle of suffering. And when he arose, when he got enlightenment, he arose and he was called the Buddha, which of course means the awakened one. And he enunciated the Four Noble Truths, which is the Buddhist understanding of how to handle suffering. So number one, the first noble truth is that life is suffering. Buddhism is really realistic about this. Life is suffering. Do not think that you're going to avoid it. It's filled with suffering. The second noble truth, though, is that suffering comes from desire. Craving and desire. Suffering is the distance between what you want and what you get. See, so you have desire, and our desires always fall short of what we actually have. So what we want and what we have, there's a gap, and that's where the suffering is. Suffering is that. So the first noble truth is life is suffering. The second noble truth is that suffering comes from craving and desire. The third noble truth is that the way to overcome suffering is to extinguish desire. The way to do that is to decrease or extinguish those cravings. And the fourth noble truth is actually is that the eightfold path to enlightenment. And enlightenment means you overcome desire when you realize that the world is an illusion, that the fact that you are an individual ego is also an illusion, that all the things you see you have but you don't have, it's an illusion that those things are different than you, because reality is we are all one. And there is no soul, individual soul, but we're all part of the all soul. And we are like a dewdrop. We're like a raindrop, which goes into the sea eventually. And it doesn't lose its being, but it loses its individuality. And so Buddhism says the more you see that basically you are one with all things, that extinguishes desire. Or put another way, is Buddhism would say, do not engage in the love of attachment, but in the love of compassion. So be compassionate, but let things go. Don't attach yourself to anything. And therefore, you would say the Buddhist strategy toward suffering is one of detachment. So the karmic is resignation. The Buddhist is no, you don't resign yourself. You change yourself so that you detach and you recognize more and more that you are one with everything, and so you lose these desires. A third approach would be the shame and honor culture. Shame and honor cultures have existed throughout history. They still exist, especially in certain parts of the world today. And the meaning of life in a shame and honor culture is that you be strong and noble and that you sacrifice yourself for the good of your tribe or your family. That's the meaning of life. And in the shame and honor culture, which is the warrior culture basically, suffering is almost welcome, almost, because it's an opportunity for you to sacrifice yourself for others. It's an opportunity for you to be strong. By the way, it's not an accident that in, you know those How to Train Your Dragon movies? The Viking father is named Stoic. And that's because the shame and honor culture says the strategy you use for suffering is stoicism. Don't let it get to you. Keep a stiff upper lip. Say, be strong. There's stoicism, there's detachment, there's resignation. Now, let me just say something brief. Those are ancient cultures. And have you noticed one thing? All of them say the way to handle suffering is to accept things the way they are. Not to try to change things. Not to try to rebel against suffering and injustice. Not to rebel against the way the world is, but to accept it and learn to accept it. And then you'll be able to handle suffering. And the modern idea that we need to change things came from Christianity, which I'm going to try to show you in a second. And I'll get to more next month if you're able to be part of our event next month. But for now, let me jump to secularism. So we looked at karmic religions, we looked at Buddhism, we've looked at shame and honor cultures. They were all ancient. And now let's look at modern secular society. Now, modern secular society, what do I mean by secular? Well, secular society either says there is no God, or if there is a God, God does not do miracles, there is no supernatural. Everything here has a scientific explanation. Secularism says really the only real world is the here and the now, the material world, the physical world. Now, how does secularism help you handle suffering? Richard Schroeder, who is a very well-known cultural anthropologist, has written a number of times that modern secular culture is the worst culture in the history of the world at equipping its members to handle suffering. He says the problem with secular culture is it has actually no strategy for helping people handle suffering. And that modern secular people have the most trouble, far more than Hindus, far more than Buddhists, far more than shame and honor, far more than everybody. Pico Iyer, who was a writer, a British trained writer who lived for many years in Japan. If you go on the internet and look up some of his, he's written some memoirs. He's left Japan now, but he lived there for many years and taught there, I think. And he points out the fact that he found that when the tsunami came or various suffering came, he was so surprised that the Japanese were much more able to take suffering in stride than modern Western people. Paul Brand. Dr. Paul Brand was a very well-known pioneering orthopedic surgeon who worked in the treatment of leprosy patients. And he was British, but he spent half his medical career in India and half his medical career, the last half, in the United States. And this is what he wrote. He said, "In the United States, I encountered a society that seeks to avoid pain at all costs. Patients lived at a greater comfort level than any I had previously treated, but they seemed far less equipped to handle suffering and far more traumatized by it." Now, why would modern secularism why would it be so bad at preparing us for suffering? Terry Eagleton, he's a British, Irish, I think, literary critic, wrote a little book for Oxford University Press called The Meaning of Life. It's called The Meaning of Life, A Very Short Introduction. It's a wonderful little academic book, but it's very short. And one of the things he says is, modern secular people, in a sense, have freedom to choose any meaning in life they want. See, all the religions tell you what your meaning in life is. They all tell you this is what you have to live for. But secular people, we can choose whatever meaning in life we want. There's freedom, Terry Eagleton says. But here's the problem. Whatever we choose in life, it's got to be something in this world. It's going to be a romantic relationship is our meaning in life, or our family's a meaning in life, or or a career is a meaning in life, or some political agenda is a meaning in life. And the problem, of course, is that suffering takes away those things completely. See, every other religion or every other culture has always said the meaning of life was something outside of this world. So either the meaning of life was going to heaven to live with God and your loved ones forever, or the meaning of life was escaping the cycle of reincarnation in order to go into eternal bliss, or the meaning of life was escaping the illusion of this world to go into the all-soul of the world, of the universe, or the meaning of life was to live a moral, virtuous, honorable life in the face of defeat and doom. But in every case, every other culture said the meaning of life is something outside of this life, which means when suffering came along and took things away from you, it couldn't touch your meaning in life. And not only didn't it touch your meaning in life, it actually could enhance it, because it gave you an opportunity to develop more detachment, or more valor, or more faithfulness to God. In other words, every other culture always said, if suffering comes, it can actually enhance your meaning in life, as painful as it is. But modern people, because they have to find their meaning in life in this world, that's the stuff that suffering takes away, stuff from this world. And as a result, secular people have got no real, they've got no ability to handle it. They've actually got no safety in the world from suffering. Now, what we, just to summarize here, secularism, however, does feel like we ought to push back against suffering. And when suffering comes, we ought to weep and cry. And the other views of the world actually don't say that. They say, no, you accept it. You don't push back against it. And you don't weep. You have to be strong. Where does Christianity fit in here? I'll show you. Let's just take the last part to talk about this. What does Christianity have to offer? Well, a lot. Luc Ferry, in his book, A Brief History of Thought, points out something that actually you can find in other history books. And that is one of the things that made Christianity in its earliest days so attractive in the Roman Empire. Why did it grow? Well, there's a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons was what Christianity offered to people to help them handle suffering. Because the Roman world was filled with a lot of the things we've already talked about. So Cicero and Seneca were Stoics, and what they taught was you shouldn't attach your heart to anything. Epictetus, the Greek philosopher Epictetus, says that when you kiss your little boy, tell yourself, well, you might be dead tomorrow. So be compassionate with your little boy, but detach. Don't invest your heart too much in any one thing. So you had the shame and honor culture, which was be strong. You had the Stoic culture, which said detach. And the average person found that very cold, very, very cold. Along comes Christianity, and Christianity gave the world three things that it never had before. It gave that culture, that ancient culture, three things it never had before in order to handle suffering. And it actually offers three things to you and me right now that secular culture doesn't offer. And here's the three things. The first thing is Christianity offers a God, presents to you a God who came into this world and suffered. No other religion says anything like that. Christianity says God, in the person of Jesus Christ, came into this world and died on the cross, suffered and died for us. Now, the reason for that we will get to later in this series. But for right now, do you realize what this means? This God is personal. And this is the only God that, of any major religion or of any worldview I know, who says that as Jesus Christ, he experienced unjust suffering. Take a look at Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Take a look at Jesus Christ on the cross. He's crying. He's crying out. He's not stoic. And he's experiencing injustice. And there's never been a faith that's actually said, unjust suffering is real. See, the karmic religion says, no, it's not real. Yes, it is. And we have a God who, if you turn to him, if you're a Christian and you have a God, you turn to him, he knows what you've been through. If you've lost a child, God the Father's lost a child. If you've been betrayed, if you've been rejected, if you have been the victim of injustice, Jesus Christ has experienced that. And so we have a God who has not only experienced injustice, but it gives us a warrant for saying, no, you don't resign yourself to the suffering of this world. You can fight against it. And you also can cry out. You don't have to be stoic. So first of all, we get a God who has actually experienced unjust suffering himself. Secondly, we have a promise that of an afterlife, which is a world of love. Karmic religions say that you can get off of the cycle of reincarnation if you live a good life, but when you become part of the all-soul, you lose your personality. You don't stay as a person. You become part of the all-soul. And Buddhism, of course, says it's an illusion that you are a person. You are actually part of the all-soul. Now, here's the problem with that. That means that after life, even if you believe you continue, there's no love there. And the deepest desire of the heart in suffering is not to lose love. There's a very, very famous Japanese poet from the 18th century, Kobayashi Issa. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Could be Issa, but Issa. And he's known for his haiku poetry. And he wrote a very, very famous poem, haiku, that I'll give you in translation in a second. But first, let me give you the background. He experienced a lot of tragedy in his life. 18th century, of course, people are going to get sick. He saw his mother and father died, but then he saw his children start to die. And in the very end, he lost 2 infant children. And he wrote a poem about it. And this is what the poem says. It's very famous. Now, this is English translation. And so follow me. It's going to be 3 short lines, okay? The world of dew. A world of dew it is, indeed. And yet. The world of dew. A world of dew it is, indeed. And yet. Now, the first 2 lines are a brilliant summary of the Buddhist approach to suffering. Because what is a dewdrop? A dewdrop is a shimmering, beautiful thing. It's shimmering and beautiful, but it's evanescent and fleeting. It doesn't last for long. And when it goes into the pond, or when it goes into the lake, or goes into the ocean, it doesn't lose its being, but it loses its individuality. And when Issa, when he was losing his children, of course, he knew that what Buddhism said is detach. Don't forget, those children are not really individuals. They are just going to be part of the all-soul. And so you have to let go. Don't hold on. Don't yearn for their love. Just recognize that we're all going toward, you might say, we're all dewdrops going into the ocean. But look at that last line. The world of dew, a world of dew it is indeed, and yet. It's like he's saying, but this is really hard. In fact, maybe it's impossible to stop yearning for the resumption of a love relationship. When somebody dies, there's no deeper desire than to say, after death, I want there to be love. I want to be with my loved ones. I want to be with a God of love. And of course, Christianity offers that. Christianity, unlike Buddhism, unlike karmic religions, what it says is this: yes, if you love someone and they die, then of course that destroys you. But the answer is not to love them less. Don't detach from people. Don't love them less. Come to love God the most. So that His love is the consolation, so that when you do lose people, you can bear it. And you can know that if I have the love of God, that means that when I die, I will be part of a world of love. I'll be with my loved ones. I'll be with God Himself. And so what Christianity does is it gives you a promise of future personal love, unimaginable love infinitely greater than any love you have here. I mean, Christianity doesn't say you're just going to be part of the all-soul, you're going to be an impersonal force, you're going to be sort of stardust in the universe. No, it says that's not the yearning of your heart. The yearning of your heart is for love. And the future after death is one of love. So first of all, it offers a God who experiences unjust suffering and who understands what you're going through and gives you a basis for fighting against it. Number 2, it gives you the promise that whatever love you lose here, there is a love in the future through faith in Jesus Christ that is available and is unimaginable. And thirdly, the third thing it offers is the idea of a resurrection. Do you realize what the resurrection means? The resurrection means that we're not going to live forever, kind of ethereally, as sort of floating, like ghosts or something like that. The resurrection is that God is going to recreate this world, and He's going to wipe it free of all suffering, and all evil, and all death, and all imperfection. And what's the promise of the resurrection is a promise not just that when you die you go to heaven and you get a consolation for the life you've lost. Oh no, Christianity offers much more than a consolation for the life you lost. It promises the restoration of the life you lost, and more. It promises to give you the life you never even had here on earth because of all of its imperfections and fallenness. And so let me just summarize. Unlike karmic religions, Christianity says, no, a lot of suffering is unjust, and you can fight against it. Unlike the Buddhist religion, we would say, no, suffering is real, and the solution is more love, not less. Unlike the shame and honor cultures, it says, no, don't just be stoic, you may cry out. And so let me just finish this way. If you actually get into the Bible and you say, okay, how do you take these doctrines, the promise of a God who suffered, the promise of a heavenly world of love, the promise of resurrection, how do you actually use that to face the troubles that we have? And let me just give you quickly 6 steps, you might say, that are that I think the Bible gives us, and not in this order, but here they are. And I'll pair them. First of all, you should weep but trust. You should weep but trust. One of the most important things about the book of Job is you see Job never turning away from God, and yet the emotional realism is amazing. Just read that book. He's questioning, why did you ever let me be born? He says, I don't understand what's going on. There's an emotional realism. But in the end, he stays faithful. And because he says, in the end, of course, there has to be a God. Otherwise, there's nobody to be mad at. Of course, there has to be a God. Otherwise, there's no right and wrong. Of course, there has to be a God. Who's to define evil, for goodness sakes? And yet, at the same time, there's this emotional realism. I guess what I mean by that is a lot of people say, well, if you trust God, then you don't have to. You shouldn't be too upset. And the answer of the Bible is, oh, no. You trust God, and yet you can be really upset. Jesus Christ said, thy will be done, but he was crying out on the cross. So you weep, but you trust. Secondly, you pray, but you think. Now, when I say pray, here's what's most interesting about the book of Job. Years ago, I remember reading this book for the first time and finding it very difficult to understand. Job seemed to be complaining the whole book. He seems to be questioning God the whole book. Well, I don't mean seems. He is. He's questioning God. He says, why are you doing this to me? Why are you allowing this suffering in my life? Why is all this happening to me? And at the end, God shows up and he actually says, Job, you have done well. I remember thinking, wait a minute, why would God say that? And I had an Old Testament professor who was teaching the book of Job, and he says, yes, Job was crying out. He was yelling, he was screaming, he was chewing on the rug. But he was doing it to God. He never stopped praying. All that complaining was in front of God. And so pray, no matter how bad you feel, but think. And what you see in Job is he's struggling, because there's places where he says, I don't know why God's doing this, but after you've tested me, I will come forth as gold. And there's other places where he said, but I know my Redeemer lives, and on the last day he will stand on the earth. He goes back and forth. He's thinking, he's remembering, he's wrestling, but he's also praying. And that, take a look at the book of Psalms. At least a third of the Psalms is like that. So weep, but trust. Pray, but think. Think about the fact that you don't see everything like you should. Think about the fact that only God can see the big picture of what's really going on. And then, last 2, reorder your loves and hope. Now, when I say reorder your loves, this would be a whole talk on its own, but I guess I'll just say this. quickly, is very often when suffering hits, you have to rearrange your priorities. You look at life and you say, these things are way too important to me. I mean, it's a bit of a joke, and I'm sorry to say this, but because I am a pastor and I have talked to people on their deathbed, and I want you to know that on their deathbed, nobody says, if only I'd spent more time at the office. Nobody does that. And when you're about to die, you look back and your priorities start to change. Okay, well, suffering gives you a chance to change the priorities now. And therefore, reorder your loves. Maybe you love some things more than you ought to. You should not love your career more than your family. If you do that, you're going to lose not only your family, but probably your career. So reorder your loves, and lastly, hope. And by hope, I mean the things we just talked about real briefly, about the heaven as a world of love and the resurrection. Here's just a couple of interesting quotes. One of my favorite places in The Lord of the Rings, not in the movie, but in the book. In the third book, Sam Gamgee discovers that his friend Gandalf isn't really dead, as he thought, but he's alive. And what Sam says is, Gandalf, he says, I thought you were dead, but then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue? And to some degree, I'm saying this carefully, and I'd have to qualify it, but if you believe in the resurrection, everything sad is going to come untrue. Or put it this way, that the world that we longed for, that we were designed for, will eventually be more infinitely glorious for all of the suffering and for all of the evil once it's restored. And therefore, yes, everything sad is going to come untrue. The other thing is, this fascinating, this is out of Dostoevsky. There's a place where one of the Karamazov brothers says this, and I'll close with this. I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, like the despicable fabrication of the impotent and infinitely small Euclidean mind of man, that in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, of the atonement of all the crimes, of all the blood that has been shed, that it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify what has happened. That's the ultimate defeat of suffering. And I believe as a Christian, that is what's being offered to me, and I think that's what Christianity offers to you.
Well, thank you, Tim Keller. We've been served by him tonight with that talk on peace in the times of suffering. Really think that he's somebody that we should give a lot more of our time to in that topic and many other topics. Just book after book of his, he really has a handle on our culture today. And so I'd encourage you at home to get some of his books and just continue to use him as a resource. We want to acknowledge, again, my name is Kirk, and this is Jason and Ryan, and we're all pastors here at Faith Community Bible Church. First of all, I want to acknowledge that we're going to have a question and answer time, but we are not qualified to answer for Tim Keller, and we won't give the same answers he gave. If you want to, after this time, you can actually go to the whole talk on Gospel in Life on their website. We'll provide a link on our Facebook page for that. And you can go there and actually listen to the Q&A that he did. And you'll probably experience that it's much better than the Q&A that we do. But nonetheless, we're going to give it a go, as they say in England. We're going to try to answer some questions. Thank you for sending in your questions. Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to pop the slide up. If you still want to text me your questions, I've got my phone right here. If you want to go on to Slido and try to do that again, then again, the meeting number is 42262 on Slido, sli.do, and you can go ahead and submit a question. We've got a few here, so thank you for submitting those. I'll start just by saying, Jason and Ryan, what did you guys think? Just your general thoughts on Keller's take on suffering and dividing it into those 4 different categories, and then how he kind of broke that down for us. What were your just general feedback and thoughts?
I agree. Settles it.
No, yeah, no, it's been as I was thinking of it, I can't help but think of Ecclesiastes because we've been in the book so much, and I just love the fact that the Christian worldview allows us to enjoy and experience all the good things that God gives us, but we don't hold on to them, we don't demand them, because history's going somewhere, and that is so incredibly unique to the Christian worldview. So,
yeah. It's helpful. He obviously touched on, just a few different perspectives in regards to suffering, but it's incredible to think of how many manifestations come out from each one of those views. Like you talked about the karmic view and the shame and honor culture and modern secular society. And so though he just kind of summarized it a little bit, it's incredible to see how much suffering comes out of just those unique views. So excited to talk a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, I love that he broke those down into those four main categories. Really helpful. We're going to start with your questions, and want to be faithful to those that did vote online. And so we're going to go with the highest voted question first. So there's no sort of rhyme or reason necessarily to that, but then we'll kind of break it down into categories. So the first question for us, and I'll just try to moderate, let Jason and Ryan speak more than myself. So the first question is this: how do you cope with losing loved ones when they are not Christians and you know you won't see them in heaven? So from a Christian perspective, somebody has asked this question. How should they cope with losing a loved one when they aren't Christians?
This is probably the apex of the problem of evil in the Christian worldview, is trying to understand how that could possibly be good, that a loved one, someone we love, why didn't they get saved? What is their eternal destiny? It's one of the most difficult questions that we can answer. But I think you can break it down in the exact same way that you break down any other problem of suffering, which is we experience something now that is unexplainable, and there's a future that we trust there will be an explanation. And so we have to approach the problem in the exact same way, that someday there will be an answer that makes sense because God is a good God. So we have to trust that answer exists, even if it doesn't exist in our mind. But secondly, and this is the other piece of it, is you don't actually know what happened in their dying moments, and so you can still hope and trust that God saved them, that in their mind they repented of their sins, and hold out that trust, and then wait for the answer. I mean, at some day you can stand before God, and God will be there to answer your question. He will be there to comfort you in that moment, and he will be there to explain every question you have when you finally get there. So it's fine to hope that in their dying moments they were saved, and then if they weren't, God will be there to explain it to you. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great point, and that comes down to just trusting in God's sovereignty, ultimately trusting in the fact that he is providential in all of life, in every aspect of life, down to our salvation, and that we can trust that is good. The passage that came to mind is Psalm 17 and verse 15, and I think there's a hope, though, I don't know if we'll ever be relieved of the pain of knowing, or assuming that someone passed on from this life without knowing Jesus. I don't know if in this life there will ever be a pain that takes that away, knowing that you won't see them. But I do think that the psalmist kind of answers what it will be like when we enter into our rest in knowing Jesus ourselves. And he says in the 15th verse of Psalm 17, he says, "As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied in your likeness." And so I do think that though that pain is not going to be fully reconciled here in this world, when we do get to heaven, there isn't going to be the pain of not seeing them, because we are going to finally be satisfied for the very reason we were created, which was to love God and be satisfied in God.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of Revelation 21:4, where it says that he will wipe away every tear. And I think that that's a promise in the gospel for us, where, that I don't know how exactly that will occur, but I know that there will be a powerful transformation, like you said, that when we awaken his likeness. So thank you for that. Couple more questions. So here's one. In our definition of suffering, what is the boundary line between necessary discomfort to grow and suffering that is detrimental and damaging. So I think it's grappling with that idea of why what is the purpose of this suffering, and when is it too much? And that age-old question, maybe, will God give you more than you can handle? Any thoughts on that?
Well, we have Romans 8, that God causes all things to work together for good. And so I think this is one of the most fundamental aspects of grappling with suffering is to learn to trust God, that whatever is in front of you right now is part of God's sovereign plan for your life, and that there's a good intention to it. It may be caused by sin, but it can be redeemed by God. And so it totally, if you once you get your mind around this concept, it totally changes the way you view the world. It really does. You say, you're not looking at circumstances and saying, how can I change this circumstance so that I can be relieved from the suffering and then return back to normal? Mm-hmm. That's not the way you look at circumstances. You say, God must have wanted me to experience this circumstance, and so what in me needs to change as a result of this uncomfortable situation? And it's no longer trying to escape circumstances, it's trying to see what God is doing through those circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I think that in our human minds, it's really easy for us to, see things as maybe inherently more moral or righteous than the other. And so it's easy to go, man, so looking back at the question, how much, what is the boundary line between necessary discomforts? It's very natural. It's natural for us to think like, if I suffered this much, like that's a good amount of suffering, like that's inherently more righteous than maybe less suffering. Or if I'm not suffering, maybe that's inherently more righteous than those who are suffering. And so I think looking at those differences, it's easy for us to, in our minds, like try and quantify what it is as what would be helpful. Now, Keller talked about Job, and my mind went to Job 42. Job says at the end of 42, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and I repent in dust and ashes. And so I think there's a neat thing that happens, right? When we do come to that realization, right, that we're not just trying to get through suffering, or we're not trying to figure out what is the right amount of suffering as opposed that is helpful, and then so much suffering that it becomes detrimental. I think we stop and go, God, whatever suffering or non-suffering causes me to see you more, and causes me to love you more, and causes me to worship you more, and enjoy you more, and be satisfied with you more, do more of that. So if that's more suffering, then do more suffering. If that is that I possibly find my righteousness in times of suffering, then take that suffering away. I want my righteousness, my satisfaction to be in you, Christ.
And one other thing to add to that is, I don't want whoever asked that question to diminish the real pain that's involved in suffering. It's like can suffering damage us? Absolutely. And there are, if someone has lost a loved one or lost a son or daughter, that's never going to go away. There's a hole and a tear in the heart that absolutely does damage the healthy person that God designed, but God's in the business of redeeming that.
Yeah, I think that's important because I was afterwards, after I asked the question, reading through it again and thinking maybe there's someone talking about an abusive situation or something like that. And I think that I've known several people that have walked through those kind of damaging situations. And I guess I would just say that along with what you said at first, Jason, that God did know that, God allowed that, and it was part of his plan in one sense for that person's life, though he always provides a way of escape and a way of redemption. And I think of people I know who I've known that have been abused as kids, sadly, and then later on in life, God used them to pour into those people's lives, to, like 2 Corinthians says, to be a comfort with the comfort that you're comforted with to other people. And I think that God is always about the business of redeeming suffering, and that's important to keep in mind. But if you're in a detrimental or damaging situation like that, of course, you need to kind of seek help outside of yourself, outside of your situation, and connect with pastors, health workers, whatever it may be. And just want to mention that. So we did have a text question came in kind of last minute. Thank you for sending this in. And I think it's, I will ask this one because I think it's important in our current kind of climate. And it says, do you believe that the current coronavirus pandemic is the wrath of God poured out on the world because of sin and unbelief? So I think that's a really important question for right now, because you'll see that on both sides, on the internet, on Facebook, things like that. So what would you guys say?
Well, I would say anytime we are in a crisis situation, one of the most dangerous types of thinking is to get narrow, is to try to think that all that's going on in this crisis is what I can see. And that's actually the case also in times of prosperity and success, that all that's going on is what I can see and how that affects me. Anytime God is doing one thing, he's doing 10,000 things. And so when you have a virus that affects the world, only the mind of God could ever unravel that matrix of cause and effects that ripples through all cultures, all peoples. I mean, it's crazy to think of how you could ever assign any cause to that. The answer to that question is, who knows? Who knows what God is ultimately doing? Now, the virus, of course, and the suffering, that is a result of sin, and God, we know that God will judge that in his time, but could we assign it to this particular thing? I don't think we could ever have that kind of perspective.
I agree with that.
Yeah, would you say that generally speaking, God expresses his wrath in the effects of sin on this earth, but specifically we can't say this is for a specific sin that we're being judged or something like that? I don't know. We have examples in the scripture where I'm thinking of Ananias and Sapphira, right, where they were struck dead because of a sin. So God judged them right away. And certainly in the Old Testament, we could point to many examples of plagues and famines and wars that were a result of judgment. So the concept, of course, exists, and judgment is never in God's economy is not primarily punitive. It's designed to alert us to realities, and so let's just assume that this virus was given by God as a judgment to the world. What's the purpose of judgment? The purpose of judgment is to awake us to see that life is short, that we will one day die. What are you going to do with that information? So I think that's.
I love that, and not that anything would need to be added to that. I'd say in light of that, I believe that is a reality, and so I think it's important for us as believers not to try and see maybe where this pandemic lines up with our own personal view of how God is going to judge, whether that is in future events or eschatologically. Let's remember that even greater than the judgment of the pandemic is still the judgment on the unbeliever who has a wicked, unbelieving heart, right? According to Hebrews, let's let something like that make us, Tim Keller said, empathetic towards people and want them to love Jesus. Because while it is hard, we don't want to be dismissive of how difficult COVID has been in our culture and in our lives and in our communities and our families. I think it's important to remember that still the greater judgment is the judgment that comes for the unbeliever, not here in this world and in this life. Like it says, right? Don't fear the one who can just kill body, but fear the one who kills body and destroys the soul. So I think remembering that gives us some compassion towards those who are under God's, not just COVID judgment, but under his judgment for unbelievers, to love the gospel and bring it to the lost.
Yeah. I liked what you said, Jason, about it being kind of warning shots, like shots fired almost. You see that in the plagues. You said in the book of Revelation as well. And I think more than anything, as a church, as Christians, we should, judgment begins at the household of God. We should say, where do we need to ask God to help us and to turn from our own sin instead of looking out at the world and saying they're being judged. We should say, Lord, what do you need to teach us right now? So, and turn to God in repentance and ask for restoration in our own lives. But anyway, we'll move on. There's a few questions here about that I think are really good about habits or practices that will help us face suffering. And then a new question came in. And so here, I'll just kind of try to summarize these real quick. So Christian habits and practices, what are they that would help us to deal with suffering? Okay, first of all, what are some Christian habits and practices? And then second, how do they differ from other religions in in how they will work, their efficacy, and also their focus? And then somebody further down asked, in other religions, what are the most compelling resources for dealing with suffering? Keller mentioned Buddhism. What else is there? And so maybe we could just talk for a minute about how Christians, like practically in our spiritual disciplines and practices, can be equipped to deal with suffering, and how that contrasts with what other religions might teach.
So the primary assumption of Christianity is that it's true, and so because it's true, you have a massive advantage, right? You actually have the God of the universe providing comfort to you. And I think I'm thinking here of 1 Peter 5, where he's talking about Christians experience suffering. And in this case, in 1 Peter 5, it's from Satan himself, being the one who prowls around like a roaring lion seeking people to devour. And he says, after you have suffered a little while, what happens? The God of grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. So there's this period of suffering where God seems absent, and we saw that in Job earlier. We see it in the Psalms, where David's crying out to the Lord. But the advantage, of course, of Christianity is that God himself, through his Spirit, will be the one who actually comforts you. And then, tying to 2 Corinthians, you can then dish out that comfort to other people who with the comfort that you've been given from the Holy Spirit. So, I mean, I think the biggest discipline here is just prayer, is just praying to God. And there will be times where it's dry, but God will meet you. Because he's real, right? That's the huge difference. Yeah.
Absolutely. You mentioned that passage there in 1 Peter. I mean, what do we want? Primarily when we're suffering, we're like longing for grace, right? Like, man, God, please, more grace to bear up under the suffering, more grace upon grace. And I love it because it goes on to say, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So it's like, man, a practice. To help in terms of dealing with suffering is praying, God, please help me be dependent on you. I need you. Help me see my need. It's not just my need that I need right now in the middle of the suffering. Help me to see that I always need you. I want to be humble because I need the grace.
Mm-hmm. And the other, I think almost every other discipline would, or habit or practice, we want to say, is going to fall into the category of perspective. Mm-hmm. So you have prayer to God, who's going to be the direct intercessor with your spirit to help you grapple with emotionally. But then reading God's word, fellowship with other believers, that's all God's grace in helping us gain perspective on about what's really going on. There's an appearance, and then there's a reality. And we have to focus on that reality through these other means that God's given us.
Yeah, I think prayer is really the big category. And I think the difference, like, this person asked about the Buddhist perspective, for example, and I think that the meditative practices that Buddhists do, I mean, Keller actually mentions this in his question and answer time, that it's not like there's nothing good to take from that. Like, a lot of sin and suffering does come from our desires. And so you can learn from that and realize that as a resource, they've tried to detach themselves from some amount of suffering through this meditative kind of practice. I think for Christians, it is that way. It's this prayer, this contemplation, this meditation, but it's more because God is real. And then Keller also mentions that, like, if you look at the book of Job, the first 39, 40 chapters, all of that is basically a long prayer conversation that Job has with God. And so at first it can kind of seem like he's complaining, he's arguing with God, but actually it's just a long conversation with God. And I think that that's the most helpful thing. It's just this ongoing, unceasing prayer that we have. And then the other category being praise. Like you see that in the Psalms over and over again. Read the Psalms if you're suffering. Every amount of suffering, which has been very little in my life, has been met with going to the Psalms, singing praises to God through the suffering. And you see that in the book of Acts, right? With Paul in chains in Philippi when he's singing at midnight. And then, of course, there's that great earthquake, a little bigger than the earthquake we had in Boise last night probably. But just there's this great earthquake in response. Doesn't mean we'll get an earthquake in response to our praise. But in a sense, you just see that picture there that praising God is this spiritual practice in the midst of suffering that is almost like the Christians, because God is real, but it's kind of like our medicine, so to speak. It really has an effect. I mean, I saw that in India. We saw that in India, all three of us, when those believers praise God with such vibrancy in the midst of a life that's absent of many of the comforts that we enjoy. Right. So anyway,
I was going to say one other thing too, is I think like I really like to appreciate. I'll say this hopefully delicately, but I like to appreciate what other religions do well at. And here's what I mean by that: the human machine is designed by God to respond in certain ways. So if a particular religion is very grateful or expresses gratitude, that they're going to have a bit of flourishing in that direction because God's designed us to be grateful people. If they deal with emotions or the intellect in a certain way, then they're going to experience a spike in that direction because God's designed us to be that way. The question is not whether a particular religion can be good in a certain area. The question is what religion enables the entire human machine to flourish, right? And only Christianity can really do that. So that's good. Yeah.
So we should probably wrap up with our time. So one more question, a couple questions kind of combined. One says, does all suffering have meaning? And then another says, how is each individual suffering unique and shared as part of the common human experience? And then how do we talk to people about their unique suffering? So maybe I'm just talking about like meaning behind suffering. How do we figure that out? Does all of it have meaning? And how would you talk to somebody about their unique suffering and what that might mean to them?
Mm-hmm. I think something that I really loved that Keller brought up, I actually wrote it down in one of his points there at the end, something that makes Christianity so different than even the other worldviews or the other approaches to suffering that we see, is he says Christianity, it warms the suffering, whereas so many other worldviews, have a very cold view and a very cold approach to suffering. It's either, stiff upper lip, like he said, right? Like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just get through it. Or it's, almost like annihilationism, like just pretend like it just is what it is because there's nothing past that. But Christianity is really the only religion, if you will, that offers a God that you worship that empathizes with its sufferers. And I think that is so unique. And so I think equally it gives us then a model to empathize with others. So if our God that we serve, if Christ, our great high priest who sympathizes with us in all our weakness can do that, then I think it gives us Christians the ability to empathize and sympathize with other people. And I don't think that means that we have to feel the need to pretend like we feel the same pains that other people feel. Like when somebody comes to us and is suffering with a certain thing, it's maybe sometimes easy in our counsel to want to pretend like we feel like what they're talking about. I think it's okay to go, man, I haven't experienced that personally, but that doesn't mean that I can't empathize with you. And that doesn't mean that I can't hurt with you and weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice and have just that basic human interaction that God created us to have, which is why I think, going back to even the other question, a good practice is don't suffer alone. Suffer in community with one another because God created us to be in community with one another.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to point out when it comes to meaning in suffering is, I alluded to this earlier, but I'll make the point again because it's so important. We have to appreciate the complexity of the ripples that go through history. And so if the purpose of life was my own comfort and happiness, then there would be no meaning because the answer is I'm not happy right now. Right? Period. So something's wrong in the universe if the purpose is my happiness. But since the purpose is not my happiness, and since the purpose is the glory of God, I can then just lean back and go, I have no idea how this is going to ultimately give God glory. It could be 4 generations from now, my great grandkids who tell the story around a fire and one of them gets saved. It could be three doors down a neighbor who saw me walking by and saw something that changed his perspective, which then rippled into his son becoming a preacher that went to the New Guinea and saved tribal people. And I never knew. And you can't know God's purposes, but know that they exist.
Yeah.
Know that there is meaning, and know that it's all working towards God's glory. One just interesting insight here. I think about David in the Old Testament. David numbering the people. It was a sin. And it says there that there was 3 kind of influences all working together simultaneously. David himself sinned. He made a choice to sin. It says that Satan tempted him, and it says that God allowed it. Like, all that's happening in that one single event. For what purpose? I mean, just imagine the complexity. The big job of the Christian is not try to figure it out, but to lean back and trust that it's working towards God's will.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. And we're going to get ready to close, but I think one of the things that impacted me, guys, is in Keller's talk was thinking about how our culture is the least equipped to deal with suffering, the secular modern culture. And so, like, shame and honor culture, like, at least you want to be a warrior and go out there and sacrifice your life. The karmic culture, you accept that this is all kind of like what you deserve, so to speak. The Buddhist culture, you're just trying to detach yourself and kind of, you accept that you need to change yourself. But really, I think we have to admit in Boise, Idaho, in America and Western culture that maybe we struggle just because this is how we view life, that it is all about us. It's about my happiness. It's about whatever meaning I've put into my own life. And I'm always looking for my own meaning rather than that overarching story of God that I think is the better redemptive story than karmic or Buddhist or shame and honor culture, and definitely better than our Western culture in lots of ways. Not to put down, I mean, there's so many wonderful things about Western culture too. But so anyway, I think with that, unless you guys have any more comments before we close up, but
Yeah, it's good.
so just for everybody kind of watching online, thank you for tuning in and just kind of being a part of this live stream. We hope it's a blessing, and just want to let you know about what's next with our First Wednesday events like this. Hopefully next month on the 6th of May, we'll be back in our building. We'll have a live audience. You can come and join us and ask questions in person. That would be preferable by far. But if not, we'll be back here on live stream and hopefully have a quality speaker to sit here. We had planned to have Dr. Tim Anstein with us to speak about the biblical flood. Can science explain the biblical flood? And so that will be his topic. If you have any need to ask any more questions about our topic tonight, or just in general, please feel free to text the number that you see on the screen, or also send an email in to any one of us. I've put my email down there, but any one of us can answer your emails. So thank you for joining us, and really appreciate and pray that you go over to gospelandlife.com and actually watch the Q&A that Tim Keller did, because I would commend that to you. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a great night.